Hello, Macbeth fans. Right, what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be recapping the events at the end of Act 3 and all the events through Act 4. Now, most of those we have covered in class. There's a couple of weird little scenes that we haven't covered in class, but I want to whiz through them quite quickly. So our learning question for this video is, can I revise and understand the events that happen at the end of Act 3 and all through Act 4? Can I remember the key events and quotations that we've already learnt in class and think about how to use those in my essay? And can I analyse how Act 4 fits into the structure of a tragedy? So there's not going to be any annotation at all, but what you might want to do is to pause the video at key points and make some notes, particularly when I'm talking about how you can use this stuff in your essay and how likely I think it is or not to come up. Okay, so what would be a really good idea, either right now or after you've watched this video through, is to remind yourself of everything that happens at the end of Act 3. So everything in Act 3 following the banquet scene that we studied last time, and the whole of Act 4. Really good idea to read that through on Spark Notes, using the easy translation on the right to recap everything that you've already learnt about those and to look at those couple of weird little scenes that we haven't studied yet. So the link is obviously on the screen in front of you, but that's a bit fiddly. So if you want to make it easier for yourself, use the link which is in the description underneath this video. Okay, so just to recap then, in Act 3, the next scene after the banquet scene is Act 3, Scene 5. And this is a really peculiar little scene where the three witches meet Hecate, the Queen of the Witches. You can see a picture of her there that I found is the triple goddess. So if you remember, we studied the triple goddess and how Polanski uses that idea of the triple goddess in his interpretation of the three witches in his film version. So that's the interpretation you've got there in front of you. Hecate is really angry in this scene because the witches have been meddling in Macbeth's business and they've done it without Hecate giving them permission to do that. So that weird little scene, there is slight controversy. Did Shakespeare actually write this, or was that added in as a bit of extra drama? There's some scenes where they're singing and dancing in that scene as well. Was that added in to appeal to audiences and to kind of break up the action a bit more before all the falling action happens later in the play? So that's Act 3, Scene 5. Act 3, Scene 6 is kind of almost like a narrator in that scene. So one of the minor characters, one of King Duncan's old entourage called Lennox, he is discussing events with a lord, and I'll just read through it. Both characters are quite sarcastic about Macbeth's recent behaviour. They joke that Fleance must have killed Banquo because he fled. They're trying to draw up a comparison there between the way that Donald Bain and Malcolm fled after they supposedly killed their father. And it kind of gives you the clue that Fleance must have originally been played by someone who looked very young. So not a teenage Fleance, but kind of maybe like an 8-year-old Fleance, something like that. And then Lennox and the Lord go on to discuss how Macduff is in disgrace because he didn't attend Macbeth's feast. That was something that we discussed when we finished annotating Act 3, Scene 4 at the end of the banquet, when Macbeth is talking to Lady Macbeth. They remind the audience that Macduff is in England. He's joined up with Malcolm's son, with Malcolm, the son of King Duncan, beg your pardon, and King Edward of England, who is also known as Edward the Confessor. And Malcolm and Macduff in that scene are trying to get up an army to take in the next scene, trying to get up an army to take on Macbeth. But significantly, both the Lord and Lennox refer to Macbeth as a tyrant now. So people aren't admiring him, calling him Brave Macbeth anymore. They're referring to him as a tyrant. So here's the definition of tyrant from dictionary.com. And it says a tyrant is a sovereign or other ruler who uses power oppressively or unjustly. So sovereign is normally the king or leader of a state, and it says they use power oppressively or unjustly. So unjustly is easy to understand. That means unfairly, obviously, but oppressive, like kind of defining a word by using another word that you might not know what it means. Let's have a look. It means unjustly harsh, causing discomfort, being excessive, being distressive. So if you're being oppressive or oppressing someone, you're punishing people really harshly or unfairly. You're making people uncomfortable to live their lives, maybe by imprisonment or whatever. The punishment perhaps is excessive to the crime, and you're adding distress to people's lives. So the next one for tyrant is any person in a position of authority. So it doesn't have to be a king. Anyone who's in authority who exercises power oppressively or despotically. And again, they've used a word to define a word which you might not know what it means. So despot's just down there. A despot is a king or another ruler with absolute unlimited power. So you're kind of throwing your power about either oppressively or as if no one is going to stop you from throwing your power about. So you can see that tyrant has lots and lots of different meanings and connotations. As a tyrant can also mean a tyrannical or compulsory influence, so someone who's quite relentless. So they're not just a tyrant occasionally if they need to deal with someone. It's kind of relentless, compulsory. And then the last one, it talks about ancient Greece or Sicily, an absolute ruler. So again, someone who can't be stopped. So in the last 100 years, the kind of tyrants that we might see would be someone like Hitler, someone like Stalin, who was the leader of Russia. A tyrant might be considered nowadays to be someone like Kim Jong-un, who is an absolute ruler. Okay, so I guess it's arguable whether people would call him a tyrant or not. Some people might say that was a bit harsh, but other people might not. So I think it is extremely unlikely that you would get an extract from Act 3, Scene 5 or Act 3, Scene 6 in your exam on the AQA paper. I'm not an examiner for the literature paper. I have absolutely nothing to do with setting the papers for the literature paper, so you can't take my word for it. But the reason why I think it's unlikely is because there are no major characters in either of these scenes. Also because Act 3, Scene 5 with Hecate is quite contentious anyway. We're not 100% sure if Shakespeare even wrote all of that scene. Many critics think it was added in later. And in Act 3, Scene 6, it's almost like a narrator who's filling in the blanks. It's like, this is what's happened since Macbeth's banquet, and this is what people are saying about it. And again, no major characters. So what's the point of knowing about these scenes then? And 3.5, arguably not much. Perhaps if you had an essay on the supernatural and about the witches, then it might be a really useful scene to talk about, but probably quite briefly. Act 3, Scene 6, slightly more useful. I think you've got one useful quotation from Act 3, Scene 6, and that's that word tyrant. And also structurally, it's a really important scene because it is the first time that Macbeth is referred to as the tyrant, rather than King or Macbeth or Worthy Macbeth or Brave Macbeth. So you can see how that's changed since Act 1. So in the second part of an essay, you could probably talk about that, thinking about the structure of the play. So the kind of thing, if you think about these ones, how is Macbeth presented as a good leader in the rest of the play? And you might write, he's not. In Scene 3, in Act 3, Scene 6, soon after his disastrous banquet, Lennox and the old man, or the Lord, beg your pardon, refer to Macbeth as a tyrant, which means, think about your definition, which hopefully you've learnt. Furthermore, the word tyrant connotes it's kind of absolute power, this kind of idea that if you're a tyrant, you go over the top, so the punishment doesn't seem to fit the crime, and so on. Those are connotative meanings of tyrant. So you could write kind of almost like a PEA paragraph analysing the fact that he's called tyrant, but actually use it as a structural point as well. So if you're AO2 in an AQA essay, you could use just that one word, tyrant, and knowing that it comes from just after the banquet scene, tick, tick, tick on your AO2 box there. So that's why that one's useful. Okay, Act 4. So just to remind you, because we analysed this a lot at the time, Act 4, Scene 1, when we were looking at witchcraft and the supernatural, this is where Macbeth returns to the witches. He sees 3 apparitions. So he hears his future from not the witches themselves, but from their masters. Beware Macduff, beware the Thane of Fife. None of woman born shall harm Macbeth, and Macbeth shall never vanquish be till great Burnham Wood, high Dunsinane Nane Hill shall come against him. You've got loads of notes for this scene. I strongly recommend that you revise that very well. We did it in our books under the topic of the supernatural. Act 4, Scene 1 is a really horrible scene because it's the slaughter of Lady Macduff and all the members of her household. Remember, it's her young son who is a little bit sassy towards the guards who invade, the soldiers who invade, and he's the first to die. He's stabbed. So a little boy stabbed by a grown man. What I'd like you to think about after you've read through that scene, Act 4, Scene 2, is what does this scene reveal about Macbeth? And perhaps you could make some notes in your book, or if you're feeling really fancy, you could actually write a paragraph. So what does Act 4, Scene 2 reveal about Macbeth? Okay, and then finally in Act 4, there's rather a long and rather a strange scene, and it's featuring Malcolm, the King of Duncan, and Macduff, one of the Scottish noblemen, otherwise known as the Thane of Fife. What Malcolm does in the first half of this scene is he tests Macduff's loyalty to Scotland, and I'll just read through the notes with you. He describes himself, Malcolm does, as a lustful man. He describes himself as a tyrannical leader, and we know what tyrant means now, tyrannical. Macduff is in despair because he'd gone to Malcolm hoping that Malcolm would be the great saviour of Scotland. And it turns out he's not. And he says to Malcolm, I can't support you. If you're basically telling me you're going to go around and rape all the Scottish women, and you're going to take all the land off all the Scottish people, and then you're going to sell off all my land to the English and to the highest bidder, basically, I can't support you. He's at the end of his rope. And basically, Malcolm turns to him and goes, only joking. The actual quote is, now I will unspeak my own detraction. So I'm saying everything that I just told you was an absolute lie. I just made it up because I'm testing you. And he says, now I can trust you, Macduff. And now that I know I can trust you, we can fight Macbeth together. So that I can become the new King of Scotland. I'm Malcolm. Ross enters into the scene in the second half. He tells Macduff about the slaughter of his family. So here's a quote: your castle is surprised, your wife and babes savagely slaughtered. So really, really important quotation there. Well worth writing down in your notes. Even if you can just remember, Ross says savagely slaughtered. And Macduff is incredulous. He can't believe what he hears. He has to ask over and over again because he just can't take it in. He can't process it in his mind. He says, my children too, my wife killed too, all my pretty ones, all what? All my pretty chickens and their dam? So those are kind of some of the repeated questions that he gives towards Ross. Malcolm says to him, dispute it as a man. So he's saying, you need to take revenge on the person who ordered this killing. We know that's Macbeth. And Macduff says one of my favourite lines in the play. I wouldn't say it's not an important line, but if you think about things I feel quite passionately against, like toxic masculinity, this is the most untoxic thing, and it shows to me what a brilliant writer Shakespeare is, working even 500 years ago. He says, I shall do so, so I shall dispute it as a man, he says, but I must also feel it as a man. So Macduff needs to process that. He needs to go away and grieve. And when he's done his grieving for this tremendous loss that he's suffered, then he will go and take revenge. He will get his vengeance. So really, really important. So this, as I said, is a weird scene, especially the first half of the scene where Malcolm is testing Macbeth. However, this scene kind of reminds the audience, or makes really clear to the audience, if they weren't latching onto it before, that Malcolm is the rightful King of Scotland. And even in this short scene, he is revealing to the audience that he has the potential to be a better king even than King Duncan, his father. Whereas King Duncan, remember, he trusted everybody. He trusted Macbeth. He trusted the previous Thane of Cawdor. Gave Lady Macbeth a diamond as a gift. He was so trusting, whereas Malcolm is showing that he doesn't trust people, and he's quite cunning. He uses this scheme to try and find out whether he can put his faith into Macduff. It reminds us, or tells us, that Macduff has a rightful reason to vengeance. So when Macduff takes revenge on Macbeth, it is righteous vengeance. He deserves it. And I think even the audience have kind of had enough of Macbeth and his immoral ways by now. We will be rooting for Macduff when he goes with the English and the other Scottish soldiers and storms Macbeth's castle at Dunsinane. So Macbeth in this scene has ordered the casual and brutal slaughter of women and innocent children. It's revealing how immoral and cowardly his behaviour has become. And remember, when we looked at Act 3, Scene 4, we talked about this idea. Not only is it the climax of the play, Act 3, Scene 4, the banquet, it's also the beginning of a reversal of fortunes for Macbeth, this moment of peripeteia. So it's going to be a dramatic reversal of fortunes, but also his character falls from grace as well. Okay, so Act 4, where could you use it in your essay? I think Act 4, Scene 1, we studied it really closely. It is likely to come up as an extract. I don't know what the percentage would be. It's a big old play, and there's lots of things which could be likely. And the witches trick Macbeth. They use equivocation. They use this deliberately vague, misleading language. They play on Macbeth's gullibility or his stupidity. And we said his gullibility previously is potentially one of his fatal flaws, and you need that fatal flaw brings about your tragic downfall. Furthermore, the scene also reveals how Macbeth has fully embraced evil. Remember, back in Act 1, Macbeth hadn't embraced evil. These supernatural solicitings cannot be good, cannot be bad. He was 50-50. He half believed that he should believe the witches, and he half realised that they were evil. But at this point, he's all in. He's 100% in. He's fully embraced evil, and he knows that it's bad. This scene could be really, really useful, either in an extract, if that came up, or for the second part of the essay. So anything about Macbeth. Could it be him as a leader? Can he be a very good leader when he's taking his advice from the agents of evil? Surely a leader should be a moral character. It could show his the way he's portrayed as a tragic hero, because this is showing his reversal of fortune and his dramatic fall from grace in the falling action. As I said, as falling hero there. Anything to do with the theme of evil. So anything to do with the theme of evil, you could refer to Act 4, Scene 1, really, really useful scene. And then anything that comes up to do with the witches, the supernatural, witchcraft, about visions, ghosts, anything like that, this is absolutely ideal to bring in for that. Act 4, Scene 2, I would suggest that an extract from this scene is very, very unlikely. There are no main characters in it. I think it is a really useful scene to refer to for the second part of an essay in the AQA, the way that they word their essay questions. So thinking about performance and about stagecraft, the Polanski film version is brilliant. And remember, we talked about how Roman Polanski, when he was a young boy, was a Polish boy in Poland when the Nazis came into his own home. And when he directed that scene, he was imagining that Hitler's SS coming into his scene, into his own home, and kind of toying with the ornaments, being quite threatening. And I think the way that Polanski portrays that in the one of the most popular film versions is absolutely brilliant. So you could refer to that for an AO2 genre, a drama point there. 4.2 shows Macbeth's fall from grace. Here, it's part of the falling action. It highlights his loss of morality. Arguably, it also shows his cowardliness. He's not leading those soldiers in to take Macduff's castle. He's just ordering the execution of basically anyone that they can find in Macduff's castle. He's taken on a castle where most of the people who are living there are servants, women, and children. He knows that Macduff is in England, so it's not even a fair fight. There's no one there to protect that family. So it shows how immoral, how cowardly he has become. And that really, really highlights that he certainly isn't like a hero anymore. That peripeteia, that reversal of fortune, showing how he's making really, really bad, immoral decisions. And then finally, if you had a question, maybe based on Act 5, Scene 1, where we see Lady Macbeth sleepwalk, she says, the Thane of Fife had a wife, where is she now? And what happens in Act 4, Scene 2 is a result of Lady Macbeth's earlier choices and the path that she leads her husband down. So it could be a really important scene to refer to when we're thinking about Lady Macbeth. Particularly about her madness and her sleepwalking and her eventual death. So this is the unforeseen result of Lady Macbeth's own ambition, the death of her friend, Lady Macduff. And the slaughter of all her children. And perhaps this was one of the key things that sent Lady Macbeth into a spiral of insanity. Okay, so Act 4, Scene 3, is that likely to come up in your exam? I'd argue that the first half of the scene where Malcolm is testing Macduff is very, very unlikely to come up. I think it's a very weird, a very, very weird section. And I think it's a very, very difficult section. However, the second half of that scene where Ross comes and tells Macduff that his family is being killed, I think it's very possible that could come up as an extract. You know, the one where Macduff is incredulous and he can't believe that his family have been killed. Not only could that come up as an extract, I also think that that moment is really important and potentially could come up in the second part of an essay for an AQA essay again. So the kind of thing, how does Shakespeare present ideas about revenge in Macbeth, could be really useful for that. How does Shakespeare present Macbeth's fate as inevitable? So again, you could link what we learn about Macduff there and how he wants to take revenge and how that revenge is righteous and justified, and you could link that into something about the witches and the apparitions in Act 4 Scene 1 as well, that yes, Macduff is someone who should really, really be on Macbeth's radar. He's the one who's going to do it. That also works really well in the structure of the play as well, because we need someone with a righteous cause to be able to get that vengeance on Macbeth. And then the final one that I thought is something about how does Shakespeare present issues of kingship in the play. Again, that could be useful for that because Malcolm is clearly established or re-established to the audience as the rightful heir to the throne. And the way that he tests Macduff as well, the way that Malcolm tests Macduff. Okay, so that is all on those scenes for now. I'm going to come back and do a bit of a whistle-stop tour through Act 5 next. Again, Act 5 has lots of scenes, but tiny little scenes building up to Macbeth's, spoiler alert, dramatic death. So see you next time. Good studying. Bye bye.